What's up everybody, how's it going? In this video, I'm going to be reacting and responding to a video that was recently posted on YouTube titled, Why You Don't Want to Work in FAANG. This video was posted by a pretty big YouTuber in the software engineering space. His name is WebDev Simplified, and the video, as the title suggests, effectively tells you why you shouldn't want to work at FAANG, at the big tech companies like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, Netflix, even Microsoft. You could include it in FAANG. It's about time that it gets included in FAANG. And I will say that over the past 6 months or so, I've seen quite a lot of these videos get posted on YouTube, or these posts get shared on LinkedIn. For example, the video that's recommended to me here as the next video to watch is called Why I Don't Work for FAANG. It was posted by Ben Awad, our good friend Ben. I just did a collab with Ben. And in that video, Ben effectively talks about the same stuff. And I figured that it might be time for me to respond to this stuff, because I feel like it's been kind of this trend lately. It's the cool thing to do. Maybe not cool, but it's certainly the popular thing or the common thing to do to criticize FAANG. And as someone who has worked at not one, but 2 FAANG companies, Google and Facebook, I feel like I certainly have some stuff to say about this. And to put it bluntly, I disagree with a lot of points that are made by these people. So in this video, I'll specifically be reacting to WebDev Simplified. And I do want to preface my reaction by saying that I'm by no means attacking WebDev Simplified. I'm not going to be insulting him or throwing shade at him or hating on him. If you're watching this, WebDev Simplified or anybody else, hopefully you won't take this as that. You will only take this as healthy debate, healthy conversation. But so with that, let's dive into this video.
I wish more people realized that the dream of FAANG is really just a nightmare in disguise.
So right off the bat, the very sort of catchy or contentious thesis of the video, I guess, that the dream of working at FAANG is a nightmare in disguise. We'll see if we agree with that. I will say, though, that this guy, WebDev Simplified, has got one of the best sets of hair on all of YouTube. I mean, I used to think that I had pretty good hair, and he puts mine, to shame. I have a lot of catch-up work to do. Mine is getting super long. What is this here? Anyway, so props to you, WebDev Simplified, for that.
In this video, I want to talk all about FAANG, which means Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, the big tech companies of the world. Because so many people look at these companies and think this is my dream job. I want to work at FAANG. It is going to be awesome. I'm going to be at Google. They do all the coolest things. They have the coolest campus. I can't wait to work for FAANG. I see it everywhere. Whether it's junior developers, senior developers, intermediate developers, all of them want to work for FAANG. But so many people don't realize that FAANG is not nearly as great as people make it out to be, and there are a lot of problems with FAANG companies. And in this video, I want to talk about some of those problems and why I personally would never work for a FAANG company.
Okay, so far he's just reiterated the point of his video. We don't yet know why he thinks you shouldn't work at FAANG. He did say that this is his opinion, or this is why he thinks you shouldn't want to work at FAANG, but let's continue.
Now, the first problem, which is one that pretty much everyone can relate to, is the terrible interviews that you have to go through to land a job at a FAANG company.
I'm not sure that I can relate to this one, but okay, let's keep watching.
You're going to have to go through multiple rounds of technical and non-technical interviews on campus, off campus, on the phone. There's a huge screening process for candidates to become either an intern or a full-time employee at a FAANG company. And this is because they get tons and tons of applicants, and they need to screen through them all to find the best ones. So it's incredibly competitive. And these interviews, they use almost all of the worst techniques when it comes to hiring candidates. They use things from whiteboarding problems to, terrible algorithms and data structure questions about things that you never actually need to know in real life, but you need to know in order to pass the interview.
So here he starts to get very critical about the whole, FAANG interview process, but he mostly says things that are just opinions, right? He doesn't really explain why he thinks that all of the techniques that they use to interview candidates are terrible, or why whiteboarding is terrible, why algorithms and data structures are bad. Because here, I've made a lot of videos, or at least I've made one video where I really rejected the notion that coding interviews are stupid or are bad or are broken. I'll probably link that video in the description below. But the summary, the general gist of things is that these coding interviews actually do a pretty good job at assessing problem-solving ability, your coding skills, your communication skills. So I'd really reject what he's saying here. The one argument that he does give is the fact that these algorithms and data structures aren't going to be used on the job. And while that's for the most part true, you're usually not going to be reversing a linked list on the job. But again, the point is the interviews assess other skills like problem solving and coding skills that are hard to assess otherwise. And again, there are other reasons for which these coding interviews are pretty good. I talk about them in that video, but let's keep watching.
This then leads to entire companies whose sole goal is to teach you algorithms and data structures so that you can go and pass an interview at a FAANG company, only to never use any of that information ever again.
Okay, he's not wrong there. There are companies that specialize in helping people prepare for those coding interviews. In fact, the best company out there is my company, AlgoExpert. If you're preparing for coding interviews or your systems design interviews, then do check out my company, AlgoExpert. Go to algoexpert.io and use the promo code CLEM, C-L-E-M, for a discount on the platform. That was a perfect plug. Thank you, Web Dev Simplified.
Because it's just there to pass a stupid interview to get hired for a company. I hate this because algorithms, sure, they're important, but is it really that important to understand these algorithms? And it also makes it so that people that don't have a traditional computer science background have a harder time getting in, because you're not going to learn algorithms in, a boot camp, for example, or on YouTube, because they're not very useful to you as a programmer or a web developer. But if you want to get hired at one of these FAANG companies, you need to know those. So the people that learn those in computer science degrees, for example, have a leg up because they're going to be better at those type of questions and interviews.
So here, first of all, he re-mentions the thing of those algorithms aren't super useful. And again, here I would point back to the video I made about why these algorithm interviews are pretty good at assessing certain skills. But apart from that, what he mentions about CS students, computer science degree students having a leg up compared to bootcamp students or non-traditional background students, I don't think that that's actually true, because a lot of the skills that you need to do well in these coding interviews aren't knowledge-based skills. There are very few knowledge-based skills related to data structures, but you can learn them pretty quickly. For example, on AlgoExpert, our data structures crash course is pretty quick. It's like a total of maybe 4 hours, 3 hours, and you can learn everything that you need knowledge-wise to then solve coding interview problems. Again, these problems test more your problem-solving ability. And as an example, I didn't go to a computer science degree, or I didn't have a computer science degree. I went to a coding boot camp. And I know some of you are immediately going to pounce, but you had a math degree. But at a math degree or at a math classes, advanced math classes in college, I did not do coding interview problems. I didn't do things that were close to coding interview problems. And a lot of people who have math majors can back me up on this and can attest that, advanced math classes like complex analysis or advanced analysis does not translate into coding interview problems, or at least not that much. So the point is, if anything, what these coding interviews actually do is they equal the playing field. There are actually a lot of people who really like these algorithm-style interviews because they say, as someone who doesn't necessarily have a computer science degree from Harvard, I can still pass the interviews at Google by just really practicing and honing my skills for these coding interview problems, applying myself, and passing the interviews. So here I really disagree with Web Dev Simplified, but let's keep watching.
So now let's just say that you pass the interview by some miracle, you get all the algorithm questions right, you pass all the on-campus, off-campus interviews, and now you got hired at a FAANG company as whatever, software engineer 1, for example. This is probably a great feeling you're going to celebrate, and you passed a hard interview. But then as you start to work and you're like, oh man, this is so cool, I'm working at Google or Netflix, you're going to quickly realize that when you start out as a software engineer 1, for example, you're going to be doing tons and tons of mundane work because they have thousands of employees in their campus. So all of the higher ranking employees are the ones doing the cool, planning and architecting of cool big projects, while you're stuck doing some debugging tasks, maintenance, IT work. You're doing all the stuff nobody else wants to do because you're at the bottom of the totem pole. You're a software engineer 1, and all the senior engineers are doing all of the cool stuff. So it may be cool working at Netflix or Google and being a part of that machine, but you're a very, very tiny cog inside of a giant machine. And sometimes those tiny cogs don't really get taken care of, and nobody really cares if they're happy or enjoying the work that they're doing. They just saying, hope you're a cog in the machine, and that's all you are.
So here, I mean, I disagree with a lot of the stuff that he says. The reason I'm hesitating a little bit is because I do think that he has, some valid points, or rather his whole point is that as an entry-level software engineer at a company like Google, you're just going to be fixing like bugs and doing like really mundane work, bad work, and then the senior engineers are doing the exciting work. That is valid, or that is accurate sometimes, depending on your team or the circumstances, but I would certainly not say that this is representative of everything. I mean, yes, there is this running joke at Google, for example, that you're getting paid, tons of money to move protos around. Protos being protobufs, something related to Google, you can look it up. But that applies to even senior engineers. And even though it's this recurring joke at Google, it's not actually depicting or representing all the work that you do at a company like Google. If anything, like I said, it really depends on your team. The team that I was on, I did pretty exciting work. I thought that my work was fun. I built an entire new product on the user interface of Google Cloud Platform. It was a brand new product. I was one of the few engineers who were really building it out. So I had a lot of kind of impact there. And I was certainly not only doing bug fixes. That's not to say that some people don't only do that, but I would certainly not say that that's representative of all the work at FAANG for everybody. And I wouldn't say that this is unique to FAANG. Ultimately, I think that at any company, you may find yourself as an entry-level developer doing perhaps slightly less exciting work than otherwise, or if you have more experience, on your particular team. And then also to the point that he made of, as an entry-level developer, nobody really cares if you're happy or if you're, having fun. I don't know how he meant it exactly, if he meant it purely with regards to your technical work or to your well-being at the company, but that's also not really true. Like at Google, you are pampered, you're given a lot of attention from, at least if you have a good manager, same for at Facebook. People really try to have you match with a good team at Facebook, for example. So really not sure that I agree here, but let's keep watching.
That's really how it feels. It's very corporate to be inside of one of these companies because you're just in a massive machine and it needs that corporate environment in order to thrive. So in order to actually move up the chain and go from software engineer 1 to 2 to 3 to mid-level to senior and so on to get to the actual cool stuff that you really want to do with FAANG, you need to go through a ton and a ton of corporate crap. I mean, you have to make sure that the boss knows that you're good. You have to make sure you network with a bunch of different people, and you have to deal with all these different corporate roadblocks. Just get promoted into a better position. So you're going to spend years and years of your life working to try to move up to do something that you really want to do, just because you want to work at FAANG. And on top of that, all of this corporate nonsense is going to slow you down a ton when it comes to development. There are tons of checks and balances inside of these large FAANG companies that ensure that all of the code you write is properly reviewed and maintained. And while yes, this is a really good thing to make sure the code that goes out is good, the problem is that when these companies are so large and so much depends on the systems you work on, the amount of stuff you have to go through just to make changes is astronomical. I mean, you're probably going to spend more time not writing code than you will writing code because you're going to be in meetings, you're going to have to deal with code reviews, you're going to have to deal with testing of your code and Q&A and all of that stuff. Well, if you were just to work for maybe a local smaller company, there's not nearly as much, corporate BS to go through because it's a smaller company. There's not nearly as much on the line, and you get to do more rewarding work because you're constantly one of the higher up developers in the company since it's not a massive company. So you're constantly working on all of the cool stuff all the time. While in FAANG, like I said, you're just a cog in the machine.
So here, I don't disagree with a lot of the points he made. The thing about the corporate stuff, a lot of bureaucracy, having to go through a lot of hoops if you want to get promoted. That's true, if I'm being honest. I think that all things considered, at least from what I heard from other people when I worked at Google who had themselves worked at non-FAANG companies, things like the promotion process at Google or at Facebook is really good compared to a lot of other companies, believe it or not. But I will say it is certainly bureaucratic. There is a lot of corporate nonsense. That is part of the game. So totally going to give it to him there. And it's probably way less bureaucratic at small startups or small businesses. As an example, at AlgoExpert, we don't have any of this, corporate stuff. Now, the other stuff that he mentioned, or the other thing that he mentioned about the, having to have a ton of tests and not being able to deploy code super quickly or whatever, that is accurate for some teams and products at Google or at Facebook. So for example, at Google, if you work on Google search, you will have to do everything that he said. You're gonna have to go through tons of testing, tons of reviews and all that to deploy just a tiny little change, because yes, it does impact billions of users. A single change can have a huge effect on revenue and all that. But I don't know if that's something that's corporate. I think that's more when you work on a huge project, and I'm not sure that's that different at other, companies, even smaller ones that have products that affect millions or billions of people. And there are teams at Google and at Facebook where this is not at all the case. So for example, on Google Cloud Platform, things move pretty damn fast, especially on newer products. I kind of had this weird experience at Google where my work felt almost like working at a startup because we were moving so fast and I didn't have all these other checks and balances. But all that being said, I do kind of agree with what he's saying here. So yeah, let's keep going.
Now, there are some benefits to being the cog in the machine though, because you get to work on large scale applications that are changing the world. Even if all you do is a very small portion of Google, let's just say that you changed the text on the homepage of Google from "I'm feeling lucky" to "I'm feeling kind of lucky." That alone is impacting millions and millions of people's lives. So you're making a huge impact with the applications you work on, but it's really hard to see that impact because usually you're very far removed from the impact you're making. Maybe you're debugging some internal tools that people inside of the team use in order to build an application that allows them to build a different application, which in turn turns into a different application that finally the end user sees. You're like 9 steps removed from the actual thing that's happening and impacting people. So while you're at a large company that impacts millions or billions of lives every day, it's hard for you to see the work that you do as impacting those people directly because you're so far removed and you're working on such a small part of the system that it's hard to see the overall system. And I know a lot of people really crave that type of encouragement you get from impacting so many people directly. And they think working at a FAANG company will give that to them because they're at a huge company that impacts tons of people. But what they don't realize is that you're not really the one impacting those people. You technically are because you're working on the code, but it's really hard to see that when you're working on it. And it can be really discouraging if your main motivation for working at that company is impacting large amounts of people, because it's really hard to see that impact and to see the difference you're making. While if you work for a smaller company, even if you only impact tens or hundreds or thousands of people, it's really easy to see that when you make a change, you're directly impacting those people because you are the main developer in that situation or one of the main developers. And you're constantly working on the main product of that company.
So here I completely agree with everything that he's saying. I think that, when you work at a company like Google, Facebook, yes, you might have an impact on billions of users if you happen to work on their primary products, because that's another thing. You might be working on a product that's completely different than their primary products. For example, for me at Google Cloud Platform, way smaller than Google Search or YouTube. At Facebook, I worked on internal tools for machine learning engineers and data scientists, so certainly not Facebook.com or Instagram.com. Although I did make one little bug fix for Instagram that actually probably had an impact on 1 billion users. But I agree, you don't really feel that change. I think people who are starry-eyed and feel like they're going to have tons of impact kind of have to get back down to reality. And at a smaller company, you will likely feel like you have more tangible impact. But I will say this does depend on the team, as always. Even at small companies, you might feel like you don't have that much impact. Really, the smaller the company is, the more likely you are to have impact. So for example, if you work on Algo Expert, you will legit feel the impact you have on customers, especially for me when I interact with them on YouTube and all that. But otherwise, yeah, totally agree.
Now, by far, the biggest thing that I think is a problem with these FAANG type companies is work-life balance.
So right then and there, already totally disagree with just that claim. This is something that I've said so many times on my channel. Let's hear the arguments, but I'm going to contain myself. I'm going to abstain myself from saying anything until I keep watching, but already disagree.
A lot of people, when they see on TV or on the movies, they see these companies, they're like, wow, they have the best work-life balance. The offices are so cool. They have crazy awesome chairs. They have ping pong and video games and all this cool stuff in their offices. That's a great place to work. But the reality is that, if you're going to be doing all those cool things like sitting around in the lounge or eating at the cafeteria or playing ping pong, The managers are going to look at you and be like, oh, you're kind of lazy compared to John over here who works 80 hours a week and never messes around on ping pong. So I'm going to, promote John instead of you. So even though you have all those perks, using them, people may look at you and be like, oh, well, you're not as hardworking, so I'm going to promote this other guy that's working way harder than you. So that can be kind of discouraging because you have all these cool things that you can do, but you can't actually use them. Also, these things are really tricks by companies in order to get you to stay at work longer. Because if they have a cafeteria built in, you're going to eat there. Maybe you eat lunch there, maybe you eat dinner there, maybe you eat breakfast there, now you're there all day. If they have a ping pong table set up, you may hang around after work and play some ping pong. And if something comes up in the company and you need to do some changes, well, you're already there, so why not just do them? And these are kind of traps that, while on the outside they look really good as employee benefits, they're really there from the employer perspective to try to get you to stay at work longer, to work more without actually realizing that you're working more. It's really not uncommon for people to spend 10 plus hours a day at these types of companies working just because of these different traps that are set up by the employer. Well, when you work for a smaller company, maybe a local company or a company that's just not a massive FAANG company, they're not going to have these traps set up to try to keep you there. And generally, you're going to find you have a better work-life balance where you're working much less hours, which means that you have more time outside to work on the things you're passionate about, spend time with your family, friends, and so on, which to me is the most important thing. I'd much rather work 20 hours a week or 40 hours a week than to work 60 or 80 hours a week. Even if I got paid 10 times as much to work 60 hours a week, it wouldn't be worth it because what are you going to do with the money if you don't have the time to actually enjoy it?
I have to address this in a few different ways because first there's the whole just work-life balance, then we're talking about some of the perks like ping pong tables and all that. So let's talk about work-life balance. I will make the caveat here that your experience with work-life balance at FAANG, especially at companies like Amazon and Facebook, will largely depend on the team and product that you work on. Now, at Google specifically, to claim that you do not have a good work-life balance is just absurd. It's completely flat out wrong. And you can ask any Google engineer or, the majority of Google engineers, because I'm sure that there are always exceptions, and they will all tell you that Google work-life balance or work-life balance at Google is fantastic. If anything, Google encourages you to have the best work-life balance. And the majority, the running joke within FAANG and Google, but even within all of FAANG, is that at Google, people just get paid to do nothing. Now, of course, it's not to do nothing. You're still working, but genuinely, working at Google is not something that I would call bad work-life balance. You are not expected to work more than 40 hours a week. A lot of people work less than 40 hours a week. You will certainly not be flagged to not be promoted because you're playing ping pong. This is just not how it works. It's not how the promotion process works at Google and other FAANG companies like Facebook. And then for the other ones like Facebook and Amazon, yes, there are some people who say that on certain teams at Facebook, for example, you will have bad work-life balance. That was not my experience at all at Facebook, and there are other people who didn't have that experience. Some did, so yes, I'm sure that it seems to depend on the team, but yeah, overall, I don't think that this is a claim that you can make on all of FAANG. And I do think that when people just always call out this work-life balance, it's either, at best, blissfully ignorant, or at worst, willfully ignorant. I don't think that Web Dev Simplified here is purposely trying to mislead people, but I really do think that it's important to get out of your head that working at FAANG is going to be terrible work-life balance. And also, I would wager that the majority of FAANG engineers are very happy with their jobs and with their lives. Of course, again, there are always exceptions, and there are some people maybe 10%, 20% who might not be happy, but the majority are. I remember at Google, there's an internal survey every year where employees are asked to rate certain things, and you're asked, do you like your life, all things considered, at Google? Do you want to stay working at Google next year? Would you recommend Google to a friend? And it's always overwhelmingly positive. So again, really, really, really disagree with this. Maybe at Amazon, it's a little bit harsher of an environment, but even at Amazon, I have heard quite a few Amazon employees who've said that on their particular teams, work-life balance isn't really an issue.
Speaking of money, another reason that people love FAANG so much is that you get high salaries. And this is pretty common across a lot of FAANG companies. You're going to be getting paid $100,000+ even as an entry-level developer. And this may sound great on the outside. until you realize that you have to move to a place like Silicon Valley where the cost of living is so high that even if you make $100,000, it really doesn't give you any better life than making $40,000 in a different state where the cost of living is much lower. So while, yes, you can tell all your friends you make six figures, really you're just as poor as someone making much, much less money than you. So really that salary doesn't actually go as far as most people think it does because they fail to realize how high the cost of living can be when they move to some of these places required by these FAANG companies.
So here, I disagree with a lot of the stuff that he's saying. There are certain things that are correct, like, just because you have a high salary or a higher salary in a higher cost of living area doesn't mean that you are wealthier or better off than if you have a lower salary in a lower cost of living area. But there are two big flaws in the arguments or in the points that Web Dev Simplified is making here. First of all, you are not necessarily going to have to work in the Silicon Valley Bay Area or in another high cost of living area like New York City if you work at a FAANG company. And here we're not even talking about everything going on right now with the pandemic. Just in general, these big tech companies like Google, Amazon, and all that, they have a lot of satellite offices, meaning offices in other parts of the country or cheaper parts of the world. So for example, you could work at Google in the Boulder, Colorado office, or you could work in the Cambridge, Massachusetts office, in the Austin, Texas office. And these locations are often the types of locations that people refer to when they talk about, lower cost of living areas that are better than Silicon Valley or than New York City. And the point is, you can work in those satellite offices even as a software engineer at Google, for example. But also, and this applies to both the satellite offices and the high cost of living areas like San Francisco, the Bay Area, or New York City, the point is that the salaries that SWEs, software engineers at big tech companies get are much, much higher than the average salary of a software engineer. As an example, when I was a software engineer at Facebook in New York City with only 2 years of work experience, and New York City is a high cost of living, area, I was making $350,000 per year in my first year. That is far, far higher than the average developer salary in New York City. So yes, New York City is super expensive, totally agree, but that was still much higher than what another developer in that same city would get paid. Same thing applies to people who are in the Boulder office or in satellite offices. You're just going to be paid more. So that is the positive thing, the fact that you are paid more compared to the norm, so to speak.
I know when I got hired at my first development job, I worked at a very small company. There was only, I think, 4 or 5 other developers there when I started, including the 2 owners of the company. So it was a very small company. And my salary was significantly lower than my friends that went to, Silicon Valley, for example. They were getting paid over double, sometimes even triple what I was getting paid. But they're still living in an apartment that costs them 4 times as much as it does for me to pay for my house where I'm living. So even though I got paid significantly less on paper, I technically was making more than them because the cost of living where I'm at is so much lower than the cost of living where they're at.
So here, I totally agree with what he's saying. The point is that if you're in a lower cost of living area, you might just be better off. And whether you're at FAANG or not at FAANG. But again, if you put people on an equal footing, 2 software engineers in the Bay Area, one of whom works at FAANG and the other one works at, non-FAANG, the one who works at FAANG will be making more or almost certainly more than the one who doesn't work at FAANG. And by the way, another argument here to give is that a lot of other tech companies that are non-FAANG, the alternatives to what FAANG is, also are based in the Bay Area or have offices in the Bay Area or high cost of living areas. Most startups, tech startups these days, or at least before the pandemic, were based or headquartered in the Bay Area. So you might have to go there for those companies and you'll be paid less than you would be paid at FAANG. But otherwise, I agree with his, cost of living analysis. You might still be better off in a low cost of living area.
Now, FAANG isn't all bad though. If these kinds of things don't bother you, then FAANG is great. If you really like working at a large company, you like being in that large corporate environment, go for it. But I know a lot of developers really don't enjoy that, and they sometimes don't realize that that's really what FAANG represents. And while you may try a long time to get into a FAANG company, you finally get in, you're super excited, it's really, really demoralizing to realize that this is maybe not what you always wanted. I wanted to make this video to really show you that FAANG companies aren't quite what they always appear to be, And sometimes the best place to get hired is in your local city or local state or town or wherever you live, because it's so much easier to get a job. You don't have to go through all the crazy algorithm interviews, and you may have a much better work-life balance. And even if you get paid less, you may actually be richer than the person working over getting paid more than you in Silicon Valley. And with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video.
So that was his conclusion, and to be honest, I agree with what he concludes in his conclusion, that ultimately, if you're someone who wants to get into FAANG and you think that a lot of the FAANG things appeal to you, then go for it. FAANG might not be for you, and also FAANG is not the be-all, end-all. I totally agree, and I think that people should not be ashamed if they don't work at FAANG, or if they, don't want to work at FAANG. But I will say that I do disagree with a lot of the points that were presented in this video, especially things like work-life balance, or the criticism about the interviews, or stuff like the fact that you're going to be fixing bugs only as an entry-level software developer at FAANG, or the cost of living stuff. I do think that there are some flaws in all of these arguments and these points, perhaps just out of not knowing, lack of knowledge. So hopefully my response will have shed some light on some of this stuff. I've heard these points made by a lot of other people, not just Web Dev Simplified, and that's that. But overall, I definitely appreciate Web Dev Simplified sharing his thoughts. I hope that you appreciated my reaction and my response to his thoughts. Let me know what you thought about them in the comments below. Do you agree with me? Do you agree with him? Do you stand somewhere in the middle? If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to smash the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter if you enjoy short-form written content. Instagram if you like pictures, and otherwise I will see you in the next video.